Hey guys, it's Jamie again from Central Sewing in Prescott Valley, Arizona. Today we're going to learn how to do beautiful bindings that are machine stitch. No hand stitching necessary. So we are going to learn how to stitch binding on and get beautiful mitered corners and perfect turning on all four of your corners so that they look completely alike. So for today's exercise, I want you to take a 12-inch quilt sandwich squared up. I made mine a little bit larger because I'm making my kids art mats for this Corona craze so that they have something fun to create art on. Then you're going to take 2 strips of cotton fabric, straight of grain. We're not going to create bias binding today just because I think it's easier to work with. And I want you to cut your strips 4 inches by the width of the fabric. So to create one continuous strip of binding, we're going to take your first strip of fabric right side up. Then we're going to take your second piece of fabric right side down. And I do actually like to leave about 1/4 of an inch overlap over at both sides, the right hand side and the bottom edge, just so that I can make sure to stitch corner to corner properly. Then I take and mark from the top right hand corner down to the bottom left hand corner, and I just use a chalk marker just to mark my stitching line. And then what you're going to do is you're going to stitch directly on that line. So this is what it'll look like when you've completed your stitching. So our stitch line is right here. We're going to go back and we're going to cut 1/4 of an inch from this stitching line using just a pair of scissors, and you can just eyeball it. So that's what it will look like. Now we're going to go take it and press it to the iron. We're going to open it up and press it nice and flat lengthwise. Then we'll get that 45-degree angle nice and flat. Next we're going to take our strip at the iron and we're going to press it in half lengthwise, the whole length of your binding strip. Once you've completed that, then you're going to take both raw edges and fold them to the center, press them down on the iron, and then take your binding strip and press it in half. And now you've created your double fold binding. Now you're going to go to the back side of your quilt, find the bottom center, and put a pin in the bottom center of your quilt. Then we're going to position the binding. Starting at the bottom center, we're going to leave about 3 inches or so to the right hand side of that pin. And we're going to line up the bottom raw edge of your binding to the edge of your quilt. And you can pin or you can clip along this line if you prefer. I just kind of hold it as I sew it. Now what you will do before we go to the sewing machine is you are going to measure 1 inch in from the left hand edge, and you're going to put a pin there. This is so that we know where to stop sewing once we get to our corner, before we get to the corner. Now, at the sewing machine, we're going to start with a center needle straight stitch. Now, I do like to move my needle 2 needle positions to the right, so my machine moves in 1/4 millimeter increments, so we're going to move it to 4.0. If yours doesn't move in 1/4 millimeters, just make sure you're at 4.0 on your stitch width. That way our needle position is just slightly off from the center, so that when we do fold it over on this edge, the stitching won't show on the front side of our project. Now, if you have a stitch in the ditch foot that allows you to move your needle position left and right, you can use your stitch in the ditch foot. You're going to put your ditch of your presser foot right in the first groove where our fabric is folded. Okay, right now I'm going to use my laser guide beam so that you can see as I sew that actually will stay right in this channel for me. And we're going to stitch from my center point of my bottom of my quilt all the way down to the inch marking from the bottom corner of the quilt. And then you'll stop. So I'm going to sew all the way down to that pin, and I'm going to pause sewing, at which point we're going to take and we're going to turn that corner of my quilt directly to me so that it's facing me, and we're going to sew all the way off the corner of the quilt. And then I'm just going to touch my thread cutter and cut my thread. Now you'll see what we just did was we created a 45-degree angle that we just sewed in. This gives us the perfect miters, so when we do turn it to the front, we get those nice crisp corners that all fold correctly. So at this point, we have our 45-degree angle. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take our binding strip and we're gonna fold backwards so that 45-degree angle, we put a little bit of tension on that seam. So we're gonna push it away from you. And then we're gonna fold it right back down to you, aligning the top edge to the edge of my quilt. Okay, and we are going to just start sewing once again, right up at the very top of my quilt, all the way down and continue on until we hit the next 1 inch from the next edge of the corner. So once we've gotten an inch from that next corner, we're gonna pause sewing. We're gonna turn that corner again to me. Okay, so that it's pointing right at me at a 45-degree angle now, and we're going to sew all the way off that quilt. Cut the thread. Then we're going to repeat the same process as before. So once you're on your final edge, what you're going to do is you're going to start sewing probably about 1/3 of the way down. Then you're going to take your pre-existing piece of binding where we began, and you're going to open it up completely. Take that pin out of there, and you're going to take and you're going to fold it down at a 45-degree angle and just press it nice and finger press it flat for yourself. Then we're going to take the binding strip that we're continuously sewing from that last corner, and you're going to lay it flat over the top, again lining up the right hand raw edge with the edge of your quilt. And we're going to go ahead and sew all the way until I get an inch past this binding strip that we have from our first initial binding piece. Okay, then we're going to back stitch. Now what we're going to do, we're going to take this original piece and we're going to cut it flush with just a pair of scissors. Then we're going to take this excess piece and we're going to cut it horizontally. Be very cautious not to cut the binding layers underneath. Okay, and then we're going to go and take this to the iron and we're going to press everything outward. So we're going to press right up against this crease all the way around at your iron. So once you press along the back crease of your binding, you're going to flip to the front side. And you're going to just take your fingers and poke all the corners straight down so that the binding wants to naturally lift. And then what I like to do is I like to press this up and around just to start to give that crease along the edge of the quilt itself. Just continue that for all 4 sides. Now on the closure side, so on the bottom of our project, what we're going to do when we go to press this in, we're going to open it completely up, both layers, and then you're going to take them together and fold them in and fold them up and around so that they close nice and securely and really flat together without having any gapping between the two. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our fusible hem tape and we're going to line it up on the inside of our stitching line where we attach the back binding piece. And we're just going to go ahead and press this down really quickly. And we're going to repeat the process for all 4 sides. Now, as you fuse this down, I highly recommend to go ahead and peel the paper off before you go to the next edge, because once this cools, it has a tendency to be very difficult to rip off. So now we're going to do the opposite edge. I'm going to do the same thing. Make sure once you do peel this off, you do not touch it with your iron because you'll have a really pretty mess on your iron. I prefer to do the fusible hem tape prior to top stitching because I think it helps keep everything positioned where it needs to be, and you can actually precisely position things prior to top stitching, and you don't have to worry about anything shifting when you top stitch your binding. So we get that really perfect ending. So So the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to take our binding and just fold it right on over and go ahead and fuse it into place. Now, I don't get the corners quite yet. I just go ahead and take and do all 4 sides. Kind of come in and maybe about an inch or so from the very edge or the very corners. Once you've completed all 4 sides, now we're going to go back and adjust the corners. So what I do find when I'm doing my corners is they want to fold naturally one direction or the other, and you don't want to force it, because one direction is going to give you a pretty mitered corner. Going the opposite way, you'll get a really fumbly looking corner where they won't line up very well. So we're going to go to the direction that it wants to naturally lay so we get that beautiful mitered corner, and then we're going to go ahead and press it down. And we're going to repeat that process with all 4 sides. Right on the inside of the binding fold. Now I'm going to leave my needle positioned exactly where it was initially, so it's going to come in just a little bit from that crease on the binding. But I do like to make my stitch length just a little longer. I typically top stitch with a stitch length of 3.5. I think it just lays a little bit nicer. And what we're going to do is we're going to just go ahead and stitch around all 4 sides. Again, if you have a stitch in the ditch foot, just put your stitch in the ditch guide right in the groove of the binding and go ahead and top stitch. So now you get all those beautiful corners turned out perfectly. So go and enjoy all your binding projects.